Well, that was a nice introduction. So let me damage myself first. As some of you know, I wrote a book called Cult of the Amateur in 2007, which was the ultimate critique of amateurism. So by defining myself as an amateur, I was displaying a degree of masochism. So let's do some damage. What did you think of that last speech? Good or bad? Who thought it was good? Who thought it was bad? Good. So I get two rules. So, you come to these sorts of, is this a marketing event, a technology event? I don't know what it is. It's a big event, big hall. Anyway, you come to these things and you're always told rules, laws. So I'm going to give you two laws up front, which you should always remember because they're true. The first is there's an inverse relationship between speeches and PowerPoints. So the more complicated a PowerPoint, the less the speaker has to say, which says a lot about my speech. The second observation, more specifically about that last speech, was beware of pets. I started in the mid-90s as a tech entrepreneur in the kind of crazy time of the dot-com boom. Nothing will ever be crazy. It was a very exciting time. I was in San Francisco. And the ultimate manifestation of the craziness of the dot-com boom was petfood.com, where investors poured hundreds of millions of dollars into online stores for selling pet food. Of course, it went bust, and the whole dot-com industry went bust with it in the late 90s. Today, we have a new boom, the boom of big data. Everything is about big data. Everything is about how to acquire consumers' data and monetize that data. And of course, when it comes to pets, it's the ultimate absurdity. So I thought the last I couldn't understand everything they were saying, but the last presentation seemed to put forward a business premised on the acquisition of data from your pets. So what they do, I don't know what they were going to do, but data associated with pets. And I think that speaks to the moral and economic bankruptcy of the big data industry. When people start trying to monetize the data on their pets, where they are, what their pets are thinking, above all else, of course, where they're pissing and shitting, we have a problem. We have a big fucking problem, and we know we have a problem. It's more than just building businesses around the behavior of your pets, what they eat, what they do, what they don't do, how much TV they watch. It's about this whole business, this whole digital business. Because in that last speech, and in many speeches, I don't want to just pick on those guys, but they were the only ones I saw, but all these speeches are kind of the same at events like this. They all talk with exuberance about innovation and disruption. They all imply that the world's going to be a better place, that it's in everyone's interest to disrupt, to undermine, to do away with the old, to embrace this new technology, whether it's the internet or mobile or hyperconnectivity or whatever other word you use to describe. And over the last 25 years, unfortunately, they've been wrong. And I've had two careers, one as a tech entrepreneur, and second as a critic of what's been happening. I think that the jury now is out in terms of what's the result of the digital revolution. When I started my company, Audio Cafe, in the mid-90s, of course I wanted to get rich. That's given. No one would deny that any entrepreneur doesn't want to get rich, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, anyone who claims they don't is lying. But it was more than that. There was a spirit of idealism, a spirit of hopefulness that reflected that first generation of internet entrepreneurs and internet idealists in the mid-90s, during the first internet boom. We thought that technology would empower, ennoble, enrich. We thought this technology revolution would make the world a better place. And that's why most of us got involved with it in the first place. Above all else, we thought that technology would create agency, human agency, Remember that word. If there's one word you take away from this speech, it's agency. It's the core of my new book, How to Fix the Future. Human agency. Technology should do one thing: empower us, create agency, allow us to realize ourselves, allow us to make our societies better places, happier places, juster places, more equal places. So right at the beginning of this digital revolution, we thought that this technology would indeed make the world a better place. We thought it would make it more democratic, more of a level playing field. But as we heard in the last speech, the monopolies that were replaced were themselves replaced by even bigger monopolists. This isn't because the new monopolists or the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are evil. It's simply a consequence of the network effect. So Google is way bigger than Microsoft. Microsoft was way bigger than IBM. Google and Amazon and Facebook and Apple, these are all nearly trillion-dollar companies. The playing field hasn't been leveled. Sure, these companies were plucky startups in the 90s. Even Amazon was once a startup. I remember Amazon as a startup in 1996. Now it's a global leviathan. We thought that this technology would enrich democracy. Everyone would have a voice. Everyone would have access to more information. Once again, we're wrong. It's no coincidence that with the digital revolution has gone the rise of a new kind of authoritarianism, a narcissistic authoritarianism that has created leaders like Trump and Putin and Erdogan and Duterte and Bolsonaro, and the destruction of democracy in much of East Central Europe. We've seen the emergence of Putin's trolls as the real victors of the digital revolution in terms of social media. Democracy then hasn't been enriched, it's been undermined. Sure, everyone has a voice, but with anonymity, when you don't know who is articulating what on this open network, on this supposedly transparent network, which is anything but transparent, which in fact is extremely opaque, you have the destruction of democracy. And we're seeing it across the world today. Democracy hasn't been in such crisis for the last 50 years. Well, what about cultural renaissance? What about the idea that this technology would allow us to talk to one another, would be more open-minded, more sympathetic, that would create what McLuhan called a global village? Of course, it would be absurd, even for someone as slightly absurd as myself, to argue that nobody has used this technology to talk to one another, and we're all talking to one another. Of course, we're talking to one another too much. Most of us are glued. In turn, there's a kind of addiction now to our supercomputers that we carry around in our pocket. But we know that the reality of this social media is, in fact, that it's antisocial, that it's lending itself to a solitariness and insularity. We're being driven into ourselves, and we're being driven into echo chambers. People aren't talking to one another. Either they're talking to themselves or they're talking to people who agree with them. And we've had the rise of more and more hostility to women and immigrants and racial minorities and sexual minorities online. The digital revolution then hasn't led to a new renaissance. If anything, it's led to what one author calls the new dark age. Well, what about work then? Maybe it might not have created a cultural renaissance, maybe not a level playing field, maybe not more democracy, but what about work? It's created lots of new jobs, a new kind of class of people who make their living, who realize themselves as human beings through technology. That's true, and many of us have been lucky enough to get work and careers through digital. But there are two problems with the way in which the digital economy has shaped the new work environment, has created a new architecture. The first is that the old proletariat that Marx wrote about in the industrial age has been replaced by a precariat. Everyone's selling their labor on supposedly sharing, which are anything but sharing networks like Uber. But the reality of the sharing economy is this new precariat is actually even more impoverished than the old proletariat, even more exploited. The average Uber driver, for example, earns less than the minimum wage. In San Francisco, which is ground zero for the new economy, where I'm from, the city of shit, where it's not dog shitting on the street, it's homeless people. Uber drivers are so impoverished they can't afford to live in the cities, they're sleeping in their cars. The architecture then of the new economy is creating a new kind of work, part-time work, exploitative work, work which huge, giant Wall Street subsidized corporations like Uber are making massive fortunes from. The company just did its IPO for about $80 billion. The second problem, of course, with work is on the horizon, the threat of AI. We've created technology that mimics all of us. Technology that enables us, not us, enables the algorithm to become a lawyer or a doctor or a driver or a fast food worker at a minimum amount of cost compared to what it involves employing a human being. So on the horizon is the threat of mass unemployment, a threat of mass unemployment that perhaps we've never seen before in our species. So the work stuff's fucked too. That's bad. Culture, bad. Democracy, bad. Equality, bad. Well, what about freedom? Sure, we all carry these devices around with us in our pocket. It has, in a sense, freed us. We can look anything up. I can look up the time of my flight tomorrow. I can check out anything I want. But when I go on Google, what am I doing? When I search on Google, I see they're a sponsor here. They can afford it. They make money out of all of us. What are they doing? Every time I go on this supercomputer to find out my way around the world, to learn something new, they know what I'm doing. The big data economy, then, is a form of what one author now calls surveillance capitalism. It's an architecture of a new kind of economy, a kind of commercial totalitarianism. There were hints at it in the previous speech about pet food. The dogs are being watched, which is bad enough, but we are being watched too. Every time we use Facebook or Google or Twitter, they're watching us. They know more and more about us. The free economy, then, is anything but free. We've sold ourselves. We've sold ourselves. The core of who we are as individuals lies in our uniqueness. Not what I see on your faces, but what exists inside you, in your behavior, in your desires, in your feelings, in your instincts, in your secrecy. And what this digital revolution has done away with more than anything else, it's commercialized, is secrecy, human secrecy. It's done away then with agency. We are increasingly becoming enslaved not only to the technology in terms of addiction, but to these huge companies that control our lives. So what are we going to do about it? We have to seize back control. We need agency. That is the great issue, human agency. We have to push back. You can't expect anyone else to push back for you. I can write books, I can make speeches, people like me can warn you, but ultimately it's in your hands as human beings. We do two things very well as human beings, collectively, and you Austrians know this as well as anyone. We break the future, but then we also fix it. So how are we going to specifically fix this future? In my book, I lay out 5 strategies. If the reclaiming of agency is the kind of Uber, excuse the word, Uber idea, the meta idea, then we can do it in 5 ways. The first is through regulation. Europeans are leading here. At these kind of events, you always get someone who says, oh, Europeans don't get it. They can't create unicorns. Only the Americans and Chinese get it. Europeans do get it. They're pioneering a new kind of regulation of big tech. They're pioneering antitrust, which the Americans now are copying. In my book, I spend a chapter with Margrethe Vestager, the former Danish deputy prime minister, who's now the EU commissioner of competition. Vestager is the only, or certainly the first person to take on these big companies, Tim Cook of Apple came to Brussels, went into her room, an hour later stumbled out and said, "That's the worst meeting I've ever had in my life." It was the worst meeting because she was the first politician to actually stand up to Apple and to Cook. And the result of that meeting was that Apple was forced to pay fines of $12 billion for not paying its taxes. These companies need to be accountable. That accountability has to come through regulation, through government. It's not about closing these companies down. It's not about splitting them up. It's not even about punishing them. It's making them accountable. So the German government's new legislation, for example, fining Facebook when they publish the trash on their platforms, the anti-Semitism, the hatred of women, of blacks, of minorities. This is a good step. GDPR is also a good step. It may not be ideal in regulatory terms, but what GDPR does is it gives us power over our data. The principle of GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, the EU initiative on data, is it allows us to carry our data around with us. And data isn't a packet of peanuts. It's not tissue paper. It's not a pen. It's who we are. We have every right to it. It's uniquely ours, and we should have access to it, and we should know what these huge, opaque companies are doing with it. So regulation is essential, but we also need innovation. How many of you are entrepreneurs? None? You don't have entrepreneurs in Austria? That was a joke. And that was the... I won't carry on in that area. Won't get myself in any more trouble. Entrepreneurs do have a responsibility. The first wave of entrepreneurs have mostly screwed up. The creators of Uber, the creators of Facebook, the creators of Google, they created fake business models which are essentially based on lies, business models which are deeply exploitative. So the guys at Uber exploited the drivers. The guys at Facebook and Google exploited us, all their users. We need more honest entrepreneurs. It doesn't mean they can't make money, but it does mean that they have to have respect for their users. We need more engaged consumers, consumers who are willing to stand up for these companies, consumers who are willing to be accountable and pay for their products, not take stuff for free and be exploited. We need more aggressive, engaged citizens, whether they're lawyers or parents or activists, whether they're politicians. This is the great challenge of our age. It's the new industrial revolution. In the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was appalling. 11-year-olds were working in factories. Cities were uninhabitable. Today, we know global warming is still a huge problem, but many of the early problems have been solved. Finally, and here's my final sort of Austrian relevant theme, we need a new kind of education system. We need an education system that focuses on agency. In the old industrial age, the education system was premised on kind of creating mini computers. Because we didn't have computers. We didn't have these things we carry around in our pocket. Today we do. We don't need mini computers coming out of schools. What do we need? We need human beings with agency, human beings who are able to think for themselves, who can be creative. Algorithms can't make speeches like this. Algorithms can't write books. Algorithms can't be sympathetic. What we need is a new class, a new generation of kids who are able not to work against the algorithm, but work with the algorithm, to add the essential human value which cannot be captured by the algorithm. And here's where Austria is interesting. You know, everyone thinks, oh, Austria, it's old, it's backward, it's 19th century, it's Habsburg. But the most interesting education idea was actually born in Austria just after the First World War. It was called the Waldorf education, invented by Rudolf Steiner. And what Steiner wanted to focus on was an education that stimulated the muscle of creativity. Today, Waldorf is a big thing all over the world, particularly, ironically enough, in Silicon Valley. People are sending their kids to Waldorf schools, not so that they learn programming, not that they use iPads. In fact, iPads are banned from preschool. because it brings out their creativity. So we need big, dramatic, aggressive human thinking. That goes together. Agency is key, regulation, innovation, consumer power, citizen engagement, and above all else, education. There is no app to fix the future. It's going to take generations, but we need to start now. Thank you.
Okay.
You want me to?
Thank you, Andrew. I love that you tried to do as much damage in 20 minutes as possible. I've got 2 questions before we jump into the questions from the audience. First, what did you think of the talk?
But also, there are going to be some people who thought it was terrible. Stick up your hand if you thought I was full of shit.
Oh, we've got a few in the back.
People.
Awesome.
Good.
We're going to have questions for you. We'll bring the microphone over to you, and you can share why you think he was full of shit. How's that? Perfect. Oh, and it's George. Excellent. So my question for you is, you said, I don't want to, you made a comment during the talk around, I don't want to get into any more trouble.
Yeah.
So what is one of the questions that you want the audience to ask you that you think would get you into a lot of trouble, and what would your response be?
All right. Well, why didn't you think of one? A really embarrassing question.
Give me a few minutes on that.
You're Canadian. You're good at embarrassing questions.
No, I'm just good at getting embarrassed.
You know, embarrassing. I like being embarrassed. The hardest question on what I said, if I was in the audience and I was sticking out my hand, I would say, this is all very well, but how are we actually going, you know, are you a Luddite? Are you trying to destroy technology? Are you against progress? And that's a question I often get, and it's an interesting question, because in a sense I am. I'm against unregulated progress, but that doesn't mean I'm against progress. So the issue of, you know, being negative and being pessimistic is one that comes up. I like to think of myself as Americans tend to be, well, you'll appreciate this as a Canadian, Americans tend to be miserable optimists, and as an English person, I'm a cheerful pessimist. So that was a terrible answer to your question. But anyway.
I'm like, and us Canadians are quite cheerful too, I think. We're somewhere in between the British and the Americans. And we've got one question over there, and then I think we had a question as well from a gentleman in a striped shirt back there.
Mr. Keane, what is your, I'm here on this side, left side.
My what?
What is your vision for 2030 if you do not follow your path?
That's a great question. I would give you 2 predictions if you don't follow my path, if we don't address these issues. Firstly, I think we're going to see the rise, and this comes back to my previous question, we're going to see the rise of a very hardcore Luddism. Because the kids who grow up with this stuff are getting very bored with it. We invented this idea of the digital native, the idea, oh, well, these kids are going to love this technology. They're already starting to hate it. They're rediscovering analog. They're the ones who have rediscovered vinyl records. They're the ones who have rediscovered handwriting. I think unless we can begin to moderate this stuff, it will be rather like the 60s. We're living kind of in the 1950s now in digital terms, and we're going to have a really hardcore reaction. The 2 other areas that I'm very fearful of is we will see the growth of a surveillance capitalism, where everything we do is being watched, including our pets, like the products that they just showed you, those guys, where everyone is being watched and all our data will be monetized, and we will have no idea what's being used. And the biggest nightmare may not be in the West, but it's in China, is through their social credit system, is the birth of a new kind of digital totalitarianism, which would have even chilled someone like Orwell, who was particularly pessimistic, where everything is being watched. And unfortunately, with the rise of a new kind of authoritarianism in the United States and indeed in Austria, it's possible that these new kind of authoritarian leaders can use digital tools to enforce their own regimes. So I do fear in the long term for democracy. It's a good question.
I know you're worried about the pet's data, but apparently somebody in the audience is not worried about their pet's data, and their pet says they aren't either. I'm joking. We do have a question from a gentleman in the back, if I'm not mistaken.
Hi, Andrew. Great speech. The surveillance situation in China, I totally agree with you. I think it's like the disaster waiting to happen worldwide. They learned this from the English, so thank you very much. With all
what
the
do you mean
cameras,
they learned this from the English?
Because that was the home of all the surveillance cameras to begin with. You just don't talk about it very much, but they got it from there. But the real point, the question I wanted to ask is, how can you say that, the younger generation that's coming up now, you're saying they're going to become Luddites. I think that's absolutely the opposite. I think they're more affine and more savvy and more smart about their use of digital technology than we will ever be. And to say that they're going to ignore it and say, no, we don't want any of this, I think is utter, absolute bullshit. It's like they're not going to go back to vinyl records. That's nostalgia, and they like it. But it's not about them eschewing or saying, hey, I don't want to have anything to do with this. It's that they're going to be better at it. And the hope is that the Amazons of the world who pay their employees $15 an hour replace the Walmarts of the world who fuck their employees for years and years, and that slowly but surely maybe things get a little better. So why is it so negative? Why so angry? That's my question. Why so fucking angry?
Well, there were two questions. I think on the kids' side, we'll wait and see. I think that, I know with my kids, they're already bored with digital. You take it for granted, every generation rebels against previous generation. I was horrified with everything my parents did, and I know my kids are severely embarrassed with everything I do. I think that next generations, this generation, the generation after the next, will turn radically and violently against digital. That's speculative, it depends on the future. We'll meet back here in 2030 and have another conversation. I don't think I am angry. People often ask me, why are you so angry? I'm not angry, I'm actually quite relaxed, but these are big issues. We've created an architecture where we're being watched all the time. You acknowledge that. We've created a company, these so-called sharing companies, that pay less than minimum wage. We've created a world dominated by Facebook, which has undermined democracy. We've created a new media system where people profoundly disrespect one another. If you're not angry about that, and I don't know what word, I don't think there's anything, I'm not even sure whether anger is a good or a bad word. But if you're not concerned about that, if you're not passionate about that, if you don't care about that, if you don't care about society, if you don't care about the civility between people, if you don't care about the viability of our democracy, if you don't care about jobs, if you don't care about those things, then what do you care about? So I'm passionate about those things. I'm not angry, but I am outspoken, because unless you speak loudly about these issues, which I do, and I write loudly about them, and I broadcast loudly about them, people don't listen. So if I'd have come up here and made a speech and said, well, on the one hand, the digital revolution is great, and on the other hand, it's not so great, you'd have all walked out. So I think there is a need to be outspoken, and if that comes across as anger, so be it. I think these things are reasons to be deeply concerned, and unless we address them now, as I said, I think things are going to get a lot worse.